Good morning. It's time for another coffee talk. Today, I want to talk about the blessing of having people of faith that have gone on before and how we can learn and be encouraged from them. I'm calling it Footprints of Blessings. I have coffee in my mug. It's some Storyville coffee. And I have this mug. It says serving him on this side. This side it says, be encouraged. What you do is making an eternal difference, one life at a time. This mug was given to us. It was a companion series. There were two of them by the Verissimo family. Probably 5-6 years ago. I forget, but it was a pastor appreciation gift. So I am grateful for people who give me coffee mugs for pastor appreciation gift. That was awesome. Today I want to talk specifically about the way that when someone walks in the faith and records it in such a way that you can follow along, how that can be a real blessing to us. And so, for instance, I have been very, very blessed and encouraged by George Müller of Bristol. And so this particular is a reprint of a book. So in 1899, this book was printed. Here's a photo of George Müller. And the Fleming H. Revel Company actually had printed this in 1899. They had offices all over. They were from London and Edinburgh, but they had offices in New York, Chicago, and Toronto as well. So this was George Müller of Bristol and his witness to a prayer-hearing God by Arthur T. Pearson. And so if you start reading through here, and this was reprinted in full, just like from the 1899 book. So it's actually just almost like a photocopy, but it's just reprinted in here. And it's nicely done. It was done by IBLP in October of 1997. And so I've read this book a lot about George Müller, and you probably are familiar with George Müller and the fact that he did the orphanages. And so I have, George Müller to me was one of those guys that many times when I'm wanting to be encouraged in my prayer life, I would go and read some of George Müller. Here I have George Müller. If you search for him online. And so you can just learn more about George Müller if you read, here, that you can read the book, you can connect here. And so what was great for me was in recent months and years, I will come and read this, and it'll talk about just what happened in George Müller's life, has his life testimony in there. But then at the end, in the appendices, there is some very specific stuff where he will talk about some of his reasons and how he prays and what he prays and how he was. And throughout the book, you are struck with the fact that there are very specific prayers of George Müller and how God will answer those very specific prayers. And so that is has been a huge part of my prayer life, is I will read George Müller and then I will be encouraged to go and pray myself. And so one of the things that I've learned from George Müller many times is that if there is something that I believe God has asked me to do, and I believe God has given me, he's told me this through his word. And so if there is something that in his word that he has used to tell me this is what I want you to be doing, well, then I can go to his word and I can read that and I can bring that before the Lord and say, Lord, this is what your word says. And you impressed on me that this was for me and for my life, and I'm supposed to be working in however the scripture applies. And I can use that as I'm praying, and it's a powerful way for me to approach the Lord and to pray. So I am grateful for George Müller. Or as he would have said it in his days, Miller. Not quite Miller, but almost Miller. So George Miller. And I am grateful for heroes of the faith, people who have taken the time to not only walk the pathway, but then to also record what God is doing. And so today, to this day still, if you go over to, and I will set this up really quickly. If you go over, I'm going to show you on the map. We're just going to go over to England, to Bristol, and I will show you the places where the orphan houses were built. I mean, you might have already actually seen these yourself. Okay, so here we go. Now you can still see me there, and you can also see my Google Maps here. So if you come to Google Maps and you head over to England, and I always have to work a little bit here to find, so here's Bristol, and so if you go to Bristol, and then you just start, you got to go a little bit north, and if you notice here it says Ashley Hill. Well, we're trying to get to Ashley Down. Oh, here's Ashley Down. This is where the orphan houses had been built. And so if we come into Ashley Down, there is, right here is the George Miller Museum. It's right there. We can actually look at this. Turn around here. So you can actually see these buildings here. And right here is still the office for the George Muller Museum. And so here you can go over to there, and if you click on this, on the actual George Muller Museum, you can go into mullers.org, and this is the short name for the foundation that is still there and what they're doing today. And so how did the foundation, what's it still doing after all these years? Well, it's actually still doing stuff. And so here's money that was raised by prayer, that they, £255,000 that were given away to free children from poverty. So they talk about all the different people, what they're helping, how they're helping. And so there is still an organization over there. So here it is. Miller's is a working name of the George Muller Charitable Trust, which is a limited liability company registered in England and Wales. So here is a website. You can go, you can see what's happening, what's the legacy of George Miller's work, and it's great. You can read. They have their history section where they have pictures of George Miller. They're talking about how he cared for 10,000 orphan children in Bristol during the Victorian era. You have all of this stuff happening. It's pretty cool. You can go to the website. You can learn history. I would also recommend that you actually take some time at some point and read the book. Like, to me, reading this book, there's other books written, and if you can get hold of some of his journals, which there's pieces of it in here, and I think there's other books, reprints of his journals, that is really powerful. You read what he was going through, what he was praying for, what he was trying. When I was reading the book, one of the things I discovered was that he had his father had sent him off to school, and in his childhood, he had quite a bit of brokenness, you might say. He was not functioning well, and he ends up being a liar, a cheat, and just in general, not a outstanding citizen. And so in his youth and childhood, when he's off at university, and even while he's at seminary, he's over there, and he's not a good exemplary person that you want to have your children use as an example of how to live life. But something happens to George Miller. He gets saved. He has an experience with God. We call it getting saved, but there's more to it than that. He met God. And as he encountered God, his life changed. And so a couple weeks ago, oh, hi, Amy, and happy birthday. Awesome that you can join today. So George Muller really impacted my life, but one of the things that he had that I didn't have, when I was a young man and I was reading his life story and I was thinking about him, I never could understand how he could be so wicked and deceptive as a young guy. But then later, when he then took God seriously, I was always challenged. How could he take God so seriously and actually obey and do what he asked him to do? And so it was a challenge for me on several levels, because his testimony was different from mine, but it was a good thing. So occasionally while I'm working here, most of the time while I'm working in my office, I have to actually be I can't listen to anything else because I'm either editing or I'm working with words. But a lot of times I have while I'm editing, I will listen to music. And so I have playlists on my own computer here. I have playlists that I will listen to on different other apps. And so sometimes I will just go on YouTube and I will listen to hours and hours of ambient music on YouTube as a way of having music that's in the background while I'm working. And especially when I'm editing, a lot of times that can work. If I'm just editing content, what people are saying, then I can have music playing while I'm doing this. This is the backstory. So I'm doing this, but then I will also occasionally on YouTube, especially, I will go to a very specific church website. So for instance, right now I'm working on a documentary with Anabaptist people that I'm interviewing. So I will go to their Mennonite churches and look on their YouTube sermons and stuff, and I will listen to get a picture, an idea of what is happening in that Mennonite church. And so YouTube gets confused because I will listen to, 3 hours of ambient Lord of the Rings or the Shire or something music, and then I will listen to like an oboe concerto, or then and then next thing you know, I'm listening to some Mennonite preaching, and then I'm back to like an 8-hour ambient music thing, and then I've got some Irish music for 6 hours, and then I'm back to Lord of the Rings, and so it goes around, lots and lots of ambient music. But I was going through this the other day, and it selected for me a church service. And it was a church service randomly in which a reenactor, and I don't even know what church service it was. It happened that I was doing accounting, so I didn't turn it off. I didn't skip it. But it was a reenactor being George Müller, and he was at a church service, and he was preaching as if he was George Müller, and he was sharing his own life story and the faithfulness of God. And he did a really good job. He was a reenactor, but he was just as if he was George Müller speaking. So I'm listening to George Müller on YouTube preaching about his own life. And as he's sharing, he tells us in the message that how he, as a young man, was coming to Christ and was wanting to truly love Jesus and walk with the Lord. And he was inspired by Brother Frank and his orphan houses. Now, up until that moment, I was just sort of listening in the background as it was going. But when he said he was inspired by Brother Frank and his orphan houses, I thought, no, it's Brother George and his orphan houses. I don't know a Brother Frank. But it made me go look. So I searched just Frank orphan houses. And very quickly started coming up with some things, but they were more in German than they were in English. And then I remembered, well, yes, that makes sense. George Müller, he's German. So it turns out that in the late 1600s and going into the 1700s, right over that turn of the century, there was a he called him Brother Frank, but it was August Hermann Francke, and he had written a book about his orphan house experiences. And I went looking for the book, and I could only find it in German because it had never been fully translated. But it was just called August Hermann Francke, Segensvolle Fußstapfen. And this guy, August Hermann Francke, lived in the late 1600s, so he was in Germany area, so he was a Lutheran. But as he was very educated, and as he was going through university, he was part of a revival, was part of the Pietist movement, got very excited about the practicality of actually studying the Word of God, and started having Bible studies and other things. Eventually got asked by several city councils to leave their towns because the universities that he was at didn't like what he was doing, but ended up being assigned to this little place out in Hall, Germany. So, and started an orphanage and a school, and ran his orphanage on very similar principles as to what George Müller was doing, where he would pray for his needs and expect an answer and see God at work. So let's go over there for a minute. If you look, here's back on, we'll come out of England here, and we'll go to Germany. So we'll leave Ashley down behind, and we'll come over here to Germany. Here we go. Here's Leipzig, and here's the little town of Halle. And if you come into Halle, here's Old Town, Altstadt. And just south of this highway, there's this place called the Frankische Stiftungen. And if you look here, we can actually zoom in a little bit and see, nestle into these university buildings that are here all around now. Right here is one of the original buildings from the 1700s. Frankische Stiftungen just means the foundation is what we would call it in America. It's a foundation. And so this, if I click on it, it opens so this is now located in the Martin Luther University at Halle, Wittenberg. That's the university that George Müller went to as a young man. He was at this university that was built around the orphanage and schools that August Hermann Francke had started. So if you go into their website, it's in German. You can tell it to translate it. But if you go into the About Us section, you can go down to, you can see a bunch of different stuff of what they're doing, but you can actually come down here, and here is the stories. August Hermann Francke, they have a statue for him there, and it talks about that how he started this. He was the beginning of this foundation, the Stiftungsgründer, from 1663 to 1727 is when he lived. And so there's still a foundation over there. That education is still happening. I don't know everything else that's going on, but I was absolutely just so impressed that here I am reading about George Müller, and it's challenging me, but here's George Müller reading about someone else, and it's challenging him. And so I wanted to tell you this story, but then I waited a bit because I wanted the book, and I could only find it in German. And so I eventually ordered the book, got it in German, and I've been reading it. Oh, and then here's Peter. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
So I'm talking about George Müller, the orphan house, and August Hermann Francke and his orphan house. So that's what I'm...
You told me a little bit about some of these stories.
So I ordered the book. I had to get it in German because they only translated parts of it into English. And so I've been working my way through this book, reading in German. And it's not... You're studying German.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to read this yet?
Too many words. I'd say the hardest part for me currently is I've learned, like words like cat and dog. I've been learning the words.
Yeah.
But not as many as I've been learning clothing name items recently.
Right.
And different ways to get around too, but I still don't know much.
Yeah, it's a lot to learn. And so to learn a language well enough to have a conversation or to read a book or even to write a book, that's a lot. But you'll get there because we're going to be studying German for quite a while yet. And we're hoping to get to Switzerland eventually and practice our German in person. So that's awesome. So, well, thanks for joining us, Peter. Yeah. But I got this book and I was reading through it. And so on Monday of this week, I was reading in this Segensvolle Fußstapfen, and I came across an account that he gives in 1698. It was October, and he tells the story how there was a godly woman, a widow, or I believe it was a godly woman that was in another part of the country, and he had felt the impression that she was in need, so he took one gold coin, the German, I think you're supposed to say ducat. In Germany, we would call it a ducaten. But, and I think you can look it up on Google. I've been trying to understand how to say this, but it's a gold coin. But I believe you say ducat. And so he sent, our August Hermann Francke actually sent her a letter with one gold coin in it. She received it, and on the day that she received it, she immediately responded back with a letter and sent it back to him and said, "This ducat that you sent me came to me at a time when I really needed it. And I was so blessed that God would see that. But I immediately, when I received it, I prayed that God would send you and your poor orphans a pile of ducats. And so that day, as he's reading this letter that he got, that this lady in another part of the country is praying for him and his orphans to receive a pile of ducats, he got a friend had been sent 2 gold ducats back from Sweden. A friend of his from Sweden had sent those. Those were delivered to him that day. He had another friend knock on the door and give him 1 ducat and then 12 of the, I guess it's a double ducat. I don't know what you call it in English, but it was worth 2. It was a coin that was twice, it was worth 2 ducats. And so he had 12 of those. And then in the post later that day, he, from someone else that was sending a gift to the orphan houses, he got 25 ducats. And then there was one other gift of about 20 ducats. So he had quite a few ducats that were beginning to pile up on his desk. But that later that week, he had a delivery was made. So previously there was a prince in the area that had passed away. And when he died, he had left behind in his will that he wanted to, it was Prince Ludwig von Württemberg die Eisenach. He died, and he'd left 500 ducats to the orphan houses. Well, after he had died, and they had worked through the whole thing, it was during this time that they delivered the ducats to Brother Frank at the orphanage. And so he had all the ducats that he had gotten that day, and then he had all the ones 500 of them, and they piled them all on his desk, and he was just sitting there looking at the pile of ducats and thinking about how that faithful woman of God had been so grateful for the 1 ducat she received that she prayed for a pile of ducats for the orphan houses, and here in front of him on the table was a pile of ducats. And so I was encouraged by that story. I thought that's so neat to see that he is also, like George Müller after him, he is giving money to people as well as receiving money for the orphans. And like George Müller after him, he writes a lot of stories in here. I mean, it's little accounts, and he's got them numbered in his book because he had published several different papers at the time. But they're stories about how the needs they had, what was going on, and how money would come in. Another one that he shared that day later was how there was he was praying one day. The orphans, they needed some things. They had some needs, and he was meditating on the Lord's Prayer. And in the Lord's Prayer specifically, it says, "Give us this day our daily bread." And he was contemplating how God says, how God instructs us to pray for our daily bread. And as he's praying for this, he's meditating on it. Give us this day our daily bread. Gib uns heute unser täglich Brot. And as he's praying about this, someone knocks on the door and brings him a gift of $400. And so he just starts praising the Lord that he received his $400, that the Lord saw his daily need and he received this $400 on the day that he needed it. And so he was so grateful for that. Another day he was working and he was busy, but there was such a big need. They had a huge need, like thousands of dollars of need. And he was trying to understand what he was going to do, but he was so busy working, he couldn't go and pray. He had to finish what he was doing with the school and what his job was. And so he thought, well, as soon as I'm finished here, I'm going to go pray. And so as soon as he's finished there, he starts going and he gets interrupted by one of the businessmen that I think was working on another part of the house, that comes to him and basically says, "Look, I've been thinking about it and it's impressed upon me. I've got to do this." And it gives him thousands of dollar gift and it sets him up. And so he still went to the place of prayer, but instead of going to pray and ask the Lord to meet the need, he went and he was reminded of the verse where it says that before you pray, I will answer. Before you call, I will answer. And so he just went to the place of prayer where he usually prayed, and he just spent time praising God, that God was a faithful God that kept providing for him. Well, I'm reading these accounts, and this is Monday, and especially the one about give us this day our daily bread. I'm thinking, well, I have needs that need to be met this week financially. And so as I'm sitting right here in my office, I actually was just right over here on the couch, and I'm just sitting there, and I had my Bible, so I flipped over to the Lord's Prayer there in Matthew. And I just was contemplating for myself, like, what does it mean? Give us this day our daily bread. This is what Jesus says we should pray. And so I'm thinking, well, and in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it's not that I need bread today, but this week I have these obligations that I need to meet. And financially, we're just not doing as well. And so I'm trying to figure out how and what. And so I finally am like, Lord, I'm just going to pray. So I'm praying. I read this, give us this day our daily bread right here, Matthew 6:11. I'm reading it out of the book, and I'm praying, seeking the Lord. And I just have a conversation that's pretty candid. I was like, Lord, George Müller would pray, and you would send someone to his door. And then, Brother Frank, that inspired George Müller, he would pray, you'd send someone to his door. It was so precious and special, Lord. It would be so really neat if you would send someone to my door with the things that we need. And so I prayed and asked the Lord for the provision that we needed, some very specific things. And then, that evening, trail life happened, and the day went on, and the next day was Tuesday, and I was rushing around, and then on Wednesday afternoon, my wife's sister Katie was here, and so we were all just chatting and talking about things, and we got on some topic of conversation, and while we were talking, it caused me to actually pull up my bank accounts for some reason. I don't even know how it all came about, but I just know that while I was talking with them, I pulled up my bank accounts only to discover that on Monday, the day that I had prayed that I thought nobody came and gave me anything, on that day, there was a deposit from one of our films that we have released already that's out there. There was a deposit, royalties deposit, into that checking account on that day. And it was about 5 times more than I was expecting. It had taken another spike, and I was just so blessed. I shared it with Stacy and Katie on the spot. I'm like, okay, so on Monday, and I had to give them the backstory, how I was praying our daily bread for the needs that we have this week. And I just wasn't expecting, I was expecting God to do something, but I was asking him, could you just have someone knock on the door? And it was like, God said, I did one better. I put it in the bank account. It's already there. And I didn't see it until several days later. But I was just really encouraged this week to remember that it's not just George Müller or August Hermann Francke. We can all, as believers, we bring our needs before the Lord. We make them known. We walk with the Lord, and he is able to do exceedingly abundantly above and beyond what we ask or think. And so we might be thinking in terms of money, and that's what I'm talking about, but there's so many other ways that God answers prayer. There's relationships. There are people that need to know him. There's all kinds of things that we can be praying about. We can even be praying for our own encouragement, our own strength to face the daily battles, all of this. But we have a God in heaven who hears. He loves us, and he wants to interact with us, and he wants us to cry out to him. And so I'm just grateful that today in Germany and in England, and these are just 2 examples, we have 2 examples of buildings that are still there, and some sort of work that's still going on because somebody was faithful 200 years ago, 300 years ago. Now with George Müller, it's 120 something years ago, actually 150. Well, time moves on. And so I just want to encourage all of us that it's a blessing to hear other people recount the faithfulness of God. And it's a blessing to be able to come to that same God and to receive from him what we need. And so I don't know what you're needing today, but I encourage you to go ahead and bring your needs before the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and he does delight to bring blessing to us. So those are my thoughts for today, the footsteps of blessing. I'll see you all next week.